Audio check. Hi, Barb.
Hi, Ward. Good to see you.
Heidi turns 40 today. How old is Molly?
45. I know. I'm still 45, so I don't know how she can be 45.
Yeah, well, you're going backwards. She's going forward.
Where is Heidi?
Truckee, California.
Oh, is she? And she has a child? Does she have kids?
One.
Nice. I'm very familiar with Truckee.
And Gemma is starting gymnastics today. Started TK last week.
Well, that's following in the family tradition. That's all right.
Yes, it is.
That's very cool. Did you get out there much?
Not a lot. They come out at Christmas time, and then we all get together in Maine for about 3 weeks in August. So
Oh, nice.
yeah.
Yeah. The problem is that kids change so fast. God, I know. I'm down valley babysitting my 6-year-old granddaughter, Molly's daughter, because Molly is getting on the Grand Canyon right now, the
Oh.
Colorado. She's doing 10 days in the Grand Canyon starting today. Mhm.
That should be on everybody's bucket list. I haven't
Yeah.
checked that one off yet.
No, I've been in there. Yeah. I'm just the babysitter.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is the Aspen City Council work session for September 5th. And today's agenda is a meeting with the HPC. Just talk about some different issues and say hello and welcome you guys. I'll kick it off just by saying, obviously, look, we appreciate all the service that you guys have done and continue to do for us and for the community. And we are happy to be here to clear up any discrepancies between our land use code and guidelines for HPC and see if we can add a little clarity to what maybe community expectations are. With that, we have a couple of questions that have come to us from HPC, and we'll honor those. We'll get to those in just a minute. But first, I think we should start by introducing members of the board. So, Kara, if you want to
sure.
start off, you are current chair, so.
Yeah, I feel like I've interviewed with all of you guys. Yeah, I'm Cara. I'm an architect, current chair of the board, trying to do my best to, improve communication here. And I'm excited we've been able to schedule this tonight.
Thanks.
I don't know.
I'm Roger Moyer. This is my second stint on the board. I was in during the 1990s, and Amy asked me to come back, so it's been a lot of fun, and I'm glad that we're all together, because it's the first time in my long years of experience that this has happened, and I think it'll be immensely helpful to you and to us. Thanks.
Kim?
Hi, I'm Kim Raymond. I'm a local architect. I've been on the other side of the table for a long time, done a lot of historic preservation projects. So I'm excited to be on this side because I have a lot of experience and think I can be helpful.
Thanks, Peter Fornell. I think I know everyone here. Nice to see you all. Just been on the board now for coming up on 3 years and just starting to get a little handle on how things are working here after the amount of time that it takes. And I'm glad that we have a chance to all have a discussion tonight.
Thanks, Peter. And then online, I see Barb.
Barb Pitchford, sorry I can't be there, I'm babysitting, but at least I can be here for a little while. Thanks for doing this, we really appreciate it.
Thanks, Barb. And then there are a few members that are not able to join us. I don't see them online as well. So Jody Surface.
She's online.
Is she here?
She's an attendee.
Okay.
She's trying, she's texting me right now, I sent her the link and she's attempting to get on.
And she just disappeared after I said.
Hi,
As you say.
sorry,
There she is.
I'm here. I'm Jody Surface. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person.
No problem. Thanks for joining us. And then are there other members? Jeff Halferty and Riley.
Riley.
Yeah, I do believe Riley's on his honeymoon. Jeff, I thought was going to be here, so hopefully he comes.
Okay.
He can join us. Yeah, Amy's supposed to be on too.
She is. She is.
Okay.
All right.
Can't see it.
All right. We want to start off and give you an opportunity to say whatever you'd like or ask opening questions. As I was looking at kind of the memo and preparing for today, you know, some of these talk directly about maybe conflicts between HPC guidelines and then the LUC land use code. So at certain times, I'm going to want some clarity in where those contradictions lie so that we can address them. I'll turn it over to you.
I can start off with kind of a broad question. I think a lot of the challenges that we see on HPC, and correct me if you guys think I'm speaking incorrectly, but are a balance between really mass and scale and affordable development rights. That's what we hear in a lot of your commentary when you do call-ups. That's what we discuss constantly on the board, is how to balance these two things. They come, I think, to the forefront of our discussion on some of the affordable housing projects that are in higher density zone districts, but I think it's a challenge we deal with across all zone districts. So we just wanted to have the opportunity to discuss this with you, to just understand where your kind of thoughts and opinions lie in what our role is in interpreting the guidelines for mass and scale as they relate to development rights, because we can't change what's allowable. That's, you know, that's your purview. So we just wanted to kind of start there, I think.
Okay, so we're all talking about the same thing. I'd love to know the mass and scale regulations and the affordable housing allotments, or how you want to call it, from our latest land use code changes. Where are these two in conflict so that we're all talking about the same thing?
Thanks for the opportunity to weigh in, and again, Amy's online, and I look for her input on this as well. But from staff's perspective, I think what we hear both council and HPC members making reference to is the relationship between allowable floor area in our residential zone districts in particular, and how that might relate to their ability to ensure that new development, as it relates to historic resources, achieves the sensitivity that the HP design guidelines are calling for. Is that a decent summary?
Absolutely.
It would be really challenging for me to call out the floor area numbers that are allowed in a specific residential zone district, because it depends so much on lot size and site constraints and things like that. But broadly speaking, that's the dynamic that I hear HPC speaking about this evening, and in their letter.
And the challenge is specifically with 100% affordable housing.
That's the one that we see.
That's the one that we're
Most
toiling with the
significant.
most because,
Yeah.
because the out of the moratorium came some changes that have reduced the overall scope of exactly what we do in review of development of parcels that have historic assets on them. So, you know, helping you tell us where you see the best spot for balance between historic preservation and development of affordable housing is going to take us further forward. You know, I mean, I just want to say, as we start this off, that, you know, as you look around our zone districts and you look around the lots that have remainder floor area on them, the vast majority of them are historic assets. And I think that we're going to see more efforts for historic assets converted to affordable housing projects, just because that's where there's FAR left to build. So I think that, you know, we've had our first challenge with the task. I think that they're going to continue in your direction for goals of both community needs of housing and historic preservation will be helpful for us to move ahead.
Thanks. Could you guys also speak to, is this a totally new issue since the latest land use code changes, or is it an existing issue that has been exacerbated, or is it an issue that's always sort of been there on 100% affordable housing? We just haven't seen that many 100% affordable housing.
Yeah, I think it's an existing issue that's been exacerbated by some of the recent code adjustments. I also think just in the last 4 years, we've had challenges. One of our ways to mitigate the amount of the amount of development rights is to encourage applicants to sell TDRs, because that allows us to have less mass on these historic properties, and we've not seen those been supported by city council. So we're in a bit of, I think, a pickle there too, because that's one of our tools.
You have not seen the recommendation to sell TDR supported by council? Okay.
I think another thing, I'm new on HPC, but I think the other thing, just from this latest project that went through with the 100% employee housing, was that we could talk about the relocation of the historic resource, but didn't have any say over what the actual building, what else was gonna be on the site, and that was very hard for a few of the members.
I think we have to talk in hypotheticals. So hypothetically, if we were to have one of those come through again, I don't think we're allowed to talk about
I
that.
just need some clarity. When was a TDR recommendation or whatever denied by city council?
I think at peak COVID was when we got a handful of requests for them. And I don't have specific projects in mind, but
I'm just trying to, because
Corey, I don't remember any TDR requests that were refused.
I don't either.
okay. But this was like 4 or 5 years ago. Well, we haven't seen a lot of them come through besides Ann Mullins. Those were approved, but.
Yeah, okay. I think I might recall one over on Ute Avenue where they wanted to land 2 and we allowed 1 perhaps. But that was landing, not separating.
Yeah.
Anyway,
We don't see landing.
Yeah, I remember one on Main Street that was allowed, one in the West End that was allowed, and that goes back 7 years since I've been on council. I don't remember one being refused.
I think there was a lot of discussion about not supporting them at the time. I know maybe some of them did get approved, but I listened to those meetings, and there wasn't general, even if some of them were approved, there was a discussion about, is this what, we want our land use code to do?
yes, the discussion was centered around landing sites primarily, but it was also about whether or not TDRs were, if they were bonus floor area, if they would be sold off. I think that was the discussion around TDRs, but that's all.
All I was going to say is Amy has her hand up. She may have
Amy?
some comments on that.
Thanks, Jim. Amy, are you there?
Hi, so sorry, too many buttons to push. I was just gonna say, you may want to sort of organize the topics that you jump into here, but I think at 925 King Street, a couple of years ago, there were some TDRs requested that council decided not to approve, not necessarily forever. I think in that specific case, there were some things you wanted to know more about the property. But I do think there's a general uncertainty about whether council supports TDRs based on some of the comments that are made when they're brought before you. So it's not so much that you've denied them, but that you've seemed hesitant a few times, and that makes the board uncertain what to message to applicants.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you for that. All right, well, let's talk about it. Let's get some clarity around it and around council members' feelings about it. I don't know that this is going to be very specific, because these would be applicants and applications for different sites. So I'm going to start with Ward.
Yeah, generally, I don't particularly support them, but they're in the code, and I understand the value of them to the owner of the asset. We've seen a couple of TDRs severed so that children could go to college. What it does is it pushes the development off of the site, and it puts that development on some other people in the community. And for me, that I don't think that's quite right, but I know it's allowable, and I haven't voted against it in my recollection. And I know we did a site visit on 925, but I don't want to get into specifics because that's a whole, I think, there were lot splits, and yeah, I just don't want to get into 925 at this point.
Well, I do want to clarify. I bring it up as a tool that we can use to mitigate the mass and scale of development that we see on historic projects. So I know it's in the land use code, but it's a tool we haven't felt confident in using to reduce mass and scale. So I think it all relates to, development rights and how big the additions are on projects. Just to kind of reframe, that's why I bring it up here for discussion.
And so do you want to hear?
I would absolutely love to hear what you guys think.
Bill?
Thanks. I'm very supportive of the TDR program. I think I'm very familiar with it. I understand a lot of the nuances of it. I think it's one of the best tools that you have and we have as a community to take some of the development pressure off of historic resources. And we're not talking about big amounts of square footage. So, one house receiving 250 additional square feet, I guess I disagree with Ward on this. It doesn't really put an unfair imposition on another neighborhood, another part of our community. So it's not like you can put 3 of them on one property. You can't land 3 of them on one property. So I think it's a very well thought out part of our land use code. I think it's proven to be effective over the years, and I'm very supportive of it.
Thanks. Sam?
Yeah, echoing Bill's comments of just being supportive of the TDR program, especially to fix the mass and scale that you talk about. And I guess my thoughts on this are just with the land use code change recently, I was sort of hoping from this meeting to hear from HPC as far as what reforms were maybe needed for that potentially to help fix this mass and scale problem. Because the TDR program is great, but I think the land use code change and the exasperation of what you just described is the challenge I'd like to face in this meeting today.
Yeah, we'll get there. John?
Yes, I support the TDR program as it applies to historic resources fully, but definitely on a case-to-case basis.
Okay, that's helpful to hear.
I'm in the same boat.
I support the program, and I can think of only one time the council has had anything to say about where they land, and that was because it was a PD. And generally, the city council doesn't have anything to say about where those TDRs land. And yeah, Bill, it's 250 square feet at a time, but that's valuable.
Are there regulations about where landing sites are?
Yes, landing sites are governed in the land use code. There are specific zone districts that are eligible to land TDRs. And when the program was created several decades ago, those zone districts were identified specifically as being appropriate places to land TDRs relative to the location of most of the historic resources in the community.
And they are eligible to land on properties that are already at max FAR floor area?
TDRs can be used to get a property over and above the otherwise allowable floor area for that property. That's correct.
Thank you. So I think you hear support for the program. Yeah, I think our whole community has concerns on some of the landing sites as well, but the initial tool as being part of historic preservation and moving some of that development pressure off, I think we all support.
Great.
Do you guys have any questions around that? Do you want any further clarity, Peter?
I have one comment. It just relates back to what I had to say about the majority of these lots in town that have FAR left have historic assets on them. You know, when a historic asset pulls off a TDR, that TDR is definitely going to get used for free market residential. And that historic asset that might get utilized for its remainder FAR for a deed restricted or affordable project will no longer then exist. So you're directing floor area towards the free market and away from the deed restricted market in the creation of those TDRs, because then that TDR that gets stripped off of a historic lot then becomes a limiting factor on that lot's ability to be used for a free market or a deed restricted purpose in the future. So that would be the only caution that I would consider.
So that's a great point, Peter, and it brings up a question in my mind. Maybe Philip knows the answer. So if I have a historic property, the FAR that I'm entitled to sort of depends on what I'm planning to do with the property, right? What the use will be, whether it's free market residential, whether it's commercial, whether it's 100% affordable housing, et cetera.
That's correct.
So to Peter's point, if one was to look at severing a TDR or several TDRs from that property, how would you know what FAR you have available to you?
Based on the allowable floor area in the zone district?
But the floor area changes depending on the use.
And the existing use at the time the TDRs are being requested?
The in-place use.
Correct.
Got it. Yeah, how do you know that the lot has been minimized as to its overall available floor area based on their previous sale of TDRs? Is that what you're getting at?
Not exactly. So, let's say, what Philip's saying is, let's say there's a historic resource that's currently being used as free market residential. It may have, let's just say for example purposes, it has 250 square feet of FAR remaining, undeveloped. They could sever one TDR from that, and to your point, it's limiting what affordable housing might be out there. But if they then converted that property to affordable housing, they would have a lot more FAR available to them.
Not if they sold those TDRs, right?
Not if they sold the incremental TDRs on top of that. But if they only sold the 250, which is all they'd be eligible to sell if it was if the use in place at the time of the severing was free market residential, in my hypothetical example, right?
I think I'm tracking.
Okay. So my point is, you create a lot of additional developable FAR if you are willing to change the use to 100% affordable housing on a historic property.
But you can't do both. You can't do both, right? You can't. Let's use an R6 lot that's 6,000 square feet and 3280 is the above grade there, and there's only a 1,000 square feet of home on the property, and there's another 2280 of FAR left, and you tear those TDRs off, then you wouldn't be able to then come back and build 3280 of affordable housing on that same lot again.
I think you might be able to build more than 3280 of affordable housing.
Well,
Not if you sell the TDR.
not if you've sold the TDRs, because then you've limited the usability of that lot.
So I don't know that we've ever seen this happen, but if someone sold TDRs and then said, I'm gonna change the use to 100% affordable housing.
Where'd they get that
do they
FAR
then
at?
get this additional new FAR?
So the TDRs remove the 250 or 500 square feet of floor area permanently off of the property. And so under that scenario, yes, a subsequent application to build 100% affordable housing would have maximum floor area less the TDRs that were severed previously. That's
Would
correct.
have its usable FAR less any sold TDRs.
That's correct.
Right, so is it 2-to-1 now, 100% affordable in R6?
Ben, can you get in here? Thank you.
Yeah, the real issue, I think, is in the mixed-use zone district on Main Street and then the RMF, kind of primarily on the east side of town. Those are the places where the community, for a very long time, has had additional density for a variety of uses, whether it be commercial or multifamily, in this case, affordable. And so that's really where this issue is. I don't think on a typical R6 lot that this is a particularly big issue. I think, you know, we'd be talking about 3240 because those are neighborhoods that were single family and duplex, you know, forever. The real issue where there is, I think, a significant sort of, you know, and for a long time, kind of community expectation is around sort of additional floor area for commercial multifamily on Main Street and certainly multifamily in the RMF. That's
Okay,
where,
so-
that's where the rub is here.
Just so I can tie a bow on this, Ben, let's say there's a RMF zoned historic asset on Main Street, and there's 1,000 square feet existing, and it's currently being used as free market residential.
Okay.
And that owner severs off 250 square feet of their available developable FAR, and then subsequently applies to convert it to 100% affordable housing. I got to imagine the FAR at that point is more than 1,250 square feet, right? I don't know what I'm not super familiar with what the ratio is in RMF, but.
I will say it raises questions, and it's, I think we had previously contemplated it for commercial, so if you know, a single-family historic home on Main Street had previously severed TDRs, and we know that there are some of those. We have thought about that, haven't had any proposals for it, but have
Right.
thought about that related to commercial. I don't know that we've thought about it related to a future then translation into affordable housing at some point into the future. But certainly we have.
But the point there is that you get more FAR,
Absolutely.
right? Even if you have severed FAR, if you're willing to do 100%.
Well, and
affordable
I would go even further and say that we've actually discouraged single family in both of those zone districts where you have the penalty down to 0.8
Right.
of what R6 allowable is. And so, I mean, further than even encouraging additional is we've discouraged single family in those two zone districts by putting a penalty on them.
Right. So the takeaway point, I guess, what I would counter, Peter, bringing this all back to what you said, is just because you've sold TDRs doesn't mean that property cannot be then developed for affordable housing.
Yeah.
But to a lesser extent.
To a lesser extent,
To a
sure.
lesser extent based on the number of.
But the bonus of floor area for a
For an affordable.
100% affordable housing use versus a free market use
Takes
is
you-
pretty significant, right? A multiple. So there's a lot of, you can do both, and they're not mutually exclusive. Sorry that took so long to hash out, but I think it's complex.
I think it's-
So on this topic, you know, do you have a level of comfort around where council and community?
Yeah, it's helpful to hear, I think, yeah, that we haven't seen a lot of these applications, so I think it's helpful to understand that you guys also view it as useful, as a useful tool.
Thank you. So I'm going to refer to the memo again, and we'll get into the mass and scale as it relates to the contradictions that HPC seems to be experiencing. So again, you know, my question about what are we talking about? What are the metrics? You're saying that you can't really offer specifics without specific cases? I mean, we all know, we all have in our consciousness a couple of things that have gone on in the past, but.
I was suggesting earlier that because the allowable floor area depends upon the size of your lot in the zone district in which the property is located, it's really challenging to put a number out there. But in my discussions with Chair Thompson recently prior to this work session, she articulated to me, and if this isn't right, please jump in, that the HPC perceives there to be a tension between broadly the maximum floor area allowed for properties and how that translates into volume, the absolute mass of a building, relative to some standards or some guidelines in the HPC guidelines, which call for, as an example, new structures, new additions to be proportional to the existing resource, right? And so if you have a situation where the allowable floor area on a site is 0.45, which is it's a big number relative to some of our small lots in town, and there's 1,000 square foot miner's cabin existing on the property, the amount of square footage you can build remaining on the lot compared to that small cottage is significant. Is that the tension that we're
Exactly.
So I think from there, what the HPC is looking for is some policy guidance from council about how to think about the direction to simultaneously make new construction respond in a sensitive way to the existing resource, while also recognizing that these properties are entitled to sometimes thousands of square feet of additional floor area, which in Aspen's context is worth sometimes millions or tens of millions of dollars, and that value, each on an individual basis, those owners want to realize that value, and that puts them in a challenging position. Is that accurate?
Absolutely.
Then is that in broad strokes related to all of your hearings, or are we still talking about 100% affordable housing?
I think it applies to both, but specifically, we see many issues with affordable housing projects.
I think out of the moratorium came some reduced review criteria for us as a HPC for the overall piece of real estate that's going to be further developed to affordable housing. The problem where we're finding balance and where we need, we have a community goal of not dwarfing a historic asset with development around it. We have a community goal of providing affordable housing, and then you have a lot that's got a tiny little cabin on it that could have a tremendous amount of remainder floor area to build affordable housing. And is it our goal to throttle that amount of new affordable housing based on our goals of preserving around the historic asset, or is our goal to allow the property owner to get to their allowable floor area in the construction of 100% deed restricted at the expense of possibly dwarfing a historic asset?
Yeah, what's more important?
Thanks. So I need to look at our legal and understand what is the HPC's ability for discretion in decision-making like this.
If I could, I think Mr. Fornell actually pointed out two distinct but related issues. So the first issue is, I think Mr. Cepino did a really good job of explaining it. You have a historic guideline, 11.2. Granted, they're guidelines. There's some flexibility in those guidelines. They're supposed to balance those guidelines. But the language is fairly direct in the sense that it says that any new building shall appear similar in scale and proportion with historic buildings on a parcel. So at Mr. Cepino's example, you could have a new structure or even an attached structure, take out the affordable housing piece, an attached structure that has the ability under your code to build a very large new structure, but yet you have this guideline that HPC has been directed to consider and give weight to, which calls for similar proportions and scale, I think is the first sort of part of this question. And to Councilmember Goose's point, I think that's an issue that relates to all kinds of development that comes before HPC, including free market residential development, for instance, in the Weston where you have large lots and some fairly large FAR availability. The second question, I think.
Wait, let's go one at a time.
That's one.
Let's go one at a time.
And please correct me if I've
No, that's correct.
misframed this.
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
that's correct.
That's a specific guideline, and I think it's a struggle to what weight to give that.
So my question then would be, in our guidelines or in the code changes in the land use code, are there parameters? Are we looking to make land use code or guideline changes that would bring those two in alignment to give direction on the discretion that HPC does have. I'm seeing nodding over here saying, yeah, that would probably be helpful. So my question to HPC as well as legal is that what we want to start this do we want to start a conversation in that direction? So we could put parameters around it, but because I hear what Peter's saying, where the community goals seem to contradict each other in this area. So we could put more precision around the language and the allotments and what expectations are.
Yeah, I think there are two things. I would ask of you guys, are you unhappy with projects that we've approved in mass and scale, just historically, of our mostly residential projects? And then the second question I would have is, would you like to put parameters around maybe affordable housing projects for how we balance this? Because that it seems to be those two conflicting goals of developing affordable housing and preserving our historic resources challenge that mass and scale guideline, and maybe we need parameters specifically for that amount of development.
Thank you. Ward, did you hear those two questions?
Yeah, and I think the crux of the matter is really what in essence is upzoning for 100% affordable housing on a historic asset. And that where that comes and bumps up against the HPC guidelines, where new additions should not dwarf the existing historic asset. And I've sat through two different HPC projects that had a lot of workforce housing on them, and I think those two things are in conflict. And I think that what our council did, before Sam and Bill were on council, was that we identified, and our councils have identified for many years, that workforce housing is a high need in our community, and that we consciously were willing to upzone properties of 100% with HPC properties if they were to become 100% affordable. And what that does is it just creates, I know we lost one unit on one application that came before us because of it dwarfing the addition, dwarfing the historic asset. And so it's, for me, how do we balance preserving and having the HPC or the historic asset stand out versus what the community really needs is more workforce housing. And I know that there are instances where by zone, HPC approved a project, and the existing asset now seems to just disappear into the surrounding workforce housing. And do we need, as HPC and as City Council, to have an adjustment on the HPC guidelines that further define that? But as far as I'm concerned, the land use code trumps the HPC. So if the City Council decides that we indeed want to upzone and allow more density, more mass and scale for 100% affordable on an HPC historic asset site, then we have to make adjustments in the HPC guidelines and somehow quantify exactly what's allowable, and that the terms dwarfing the historic asset have to be further defined, I think. And so it's what the community needs, according to my feeling, is more workforce housing to have 100% affordable on an asset lot versus having less developable additional space that goes free market. And what the pressures are of a free market on the workforce for demanding more people to keep that asset up and running versus having that space used to house workers in our community.
Thanks, Ward. I'm gonna start at this end this time. She actually just asked two specific questions. One was, do you feel like the current allotments for redevelopment on historic properties is successful?
Yeah, do you think we're doing a good job approving projects?
Right.
Yeah.
Are our current guidelines getting us even what we want?
Yes.
So that was question one. And question two?
Would you want to see guidelines put in place around affordable housing projects?
I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. I would agree mostly with what Ward said, and I understand where HBC's concerns come from. I've noticed one recent historic project, the historic element did kind of get swallowed by the mass of the addition. And I'd like for that not to happen again, but as Ward pointed out, one of our top 3 goals is providing workforce housing, and we're running out of places to put it. And the project that's come up in front of us recently, I think, is an important step forward in separating the historic component from the rest of the project. So I actually think that as it stands, I'm happy with it. I think we gave our building department, our ComDev department, a job to do, and these are the solutions they came back with. We are trying to build as much employee housing as possible, as quickly as possible. I will be more mindful of the projects that come before us in the future, of course. And I do want to thank you all for your service on HPC. It's an extremely valuable part of our community.
Thanks. Do you mind if I ask John a question? It's my interpretation that with this updated land use code, to me, it's quite clear that you've prioritized affordable housing over the historic, the balancing of the massing. But I am tasked, or whoever I assign is tasked, with working with city staff to approve the rest of the development for those projects. So I guess I would like to just like clearly understand, you do expect that these affordable housing projects have more massing than the typical projects that we've approved?
I don't know that I would expect it, but I do expect whoever's in charge of these projects to try and get the maximum amount of housing on that parcel.
Okay.
So excuse me, go ahead, Peter.
So you would be encouraging development application to exercise all of their available rights of floor area for a 100% affordable project on a lot that contains a historic asset?
You know, I trust our staff to work in the best interests of our community. It may not seem that way to everybody, but I believe in our staff, and I trust that they're going to try to balance our community.
And I trust our land use code and the floor area amounts that have been attached to them. And so I want to say one thing about the recognition thing about affordable housing. You know, at one spot in our guidelines, it states that a new addition needs to be representative of the historic property that's being built around. In another part of our guidelines, it says that a new addition should be a product of its own time. Those are competing statements right there.
We'll come back to that. If you don't mind, I want to stay on topic, but I'm going to write that down. We'll come back to that.
All right, and I have it too, so.
Yeah. John, I ask because it's not just city staff who has to approve the affordable housing development part of the project.
Right.
It's also one of us. That's why I'm asking. Yeah.
Sam, I want your input on this topic of how are we doing so far, and do you have different expectations for affordable versus free market?
Yeah, I think the answer is always somewhere in between rather than one swinging the lever or the other. I think the bottom line for me is that I trust HPC, and what I'd like to see come out of this is that we put more peer review back to HPC to look at mass and scale, because I don't think any of you guys are against affordable housing. I just think, and then you have like NIMBYism on the other side, but there's somewhere in between where there's a respectable amount of affordable housing and a respect of the historic asset, and I'd like the peer review to allow you guys to do your job in that way, and I feel like that's what might have been taken away from you in this whole land use code change.
Bill?
Thanks. So question one. I think I'm very comfortable with your decisions. I think you are all thoughtful, intelligent, caring members of the community, and you're serving, which I'm appreciative of, on the HPC, which means that you're knowledgeable and passionate about this historical aspect of our community. And so that should be your priority. And you should use that as your primary lens in your decision-making. Yes, housing development has been a stated goal of the community, but that's not what you should be most focused on when you evaluate projects, in my opinion.
I appreciate that your council is just as conflicted as our board.
Well, I didn't say I disagreed with anything there, to be
Yeah.
clear.
Yeah.
I'm just saying I want you, in your role evaluating applications, to be focused on what you're there to do, which
Absolutely.
is preserve the historic integrity of our assets in our community. I want to sort of make one statement that's relevant to this and then come back to your second question. So I think applicants are always going to utilize 100% of the available FAR, whether it's free market, whether it's affordable housing or not. So any potential change to guidelines or the land use code should anticipate that that's going to be the result. Maybe 1 out of 100, it's not going to be the result, but 99% of the time, everyone's going to ask for what's available to them. And so I think you need to assume that and understand that. And for me, that's just a blatant expectation. I do think some of these guidelines need to be updated and potentially some changes to the land use code. The suggestion that I would make for 11.2 is based on the fact that that guideline is almost never respected, and particularly not respected on small miners cabins. It's impossible to respect it if you're going to utilize even a meaningful portion of the available FAR. So perhaps it should say something like, the new development needs to be complementary and congruent to the historic asset, and leave that up to your discretion. You are all highly capable of making those decisions and using good discretion for that. So I would be comfortable with something along those lines with respect to 11.2. You know, the question of should there be this much available FAR for 100% affordable housing proposals or applications on historic properties is a question for the council table, and I don't know if that's of interest in being revisited at this time or not, but they're sort of two separate issues, and I think both are worth acknowledging. Does that answer both of your questions?
I think so, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I have not been that happy with what I've seen for historic preservation. Mostly, you know, I'm referring to some of the projects and builds that I've seen in the West End. I don't think that it is complementary. I don't think it is respectful of the historic resource. That's not HPC's fault. That's the guidelines' fault and the land use code. I will also say that I do accept more affordable housing on historic properties than non-affordable housing. And as a matter of fact, to me, when it is an affordable project, I think it highlights the historic resource more than a free market development. It is something that when I've traveled to other mountain towns and I see something like that, it gives me great appreciation for that parcel, for that property, and for the project. So for me, historic resource, it really does fulfill its role and honor our history as well as chart our course for the future with affordable housing. So the answer for me is no, I'm sorry. I haven't really always appreciated what this community has gotten when it comes to historic preservation. And yes, I do think that it is different for me for affordable housing and for free market development and how that property is treated. I do, and I made a note here, language change about the phraseology in 11.2 being complementary. I agree. I think that HPC can do this. It can sit with you guys. I think that you have the ability, and from some of the meeting notes that I've seen, is you have strived for that balance. I think we've had a little bit of success on a project here or there in our community. Some of those are even what Peter has brought to our community. So, I mean, I think that you guys can do it. I think that maybe some parameters around it, some language changes perhaps can give you a little bit more clarity. My question back to you is that the seat that you want to be in? Does HPC want to be doing that? Do the members of HPC want guidelines that are cut and dried and do not change for anything or anybody or any project? If that's the case, then I don't know why we have commissioners and we don't just have a code. But if truly this board and your board wants to be in that position, then I think that you could do it. But do you is that what you guys want to be doing at that table? I don't know.
I think it's what they are doing. To clarify, when I said I was talking about that everyone's going to utilize the maximum FAR, I don't think that you should explicitly state that someone should come back with less FAR. I think you should say you need to make the addition more congruent with the historic asset. And so the reason I added that wasn't just because I wanted to get in the last word, but is because I think utilizing that tool, they're more than capable and they're already doing that, and I hope they're comfortable.
But isn't that the same request? Having less FAR, or coming back with less FAR is the same request as coming back with something that's more congruent with the.
Not necessarily.
To get to the top of massing, you're gonna, I can think of 3 approved affordable housing projects that have been completed pre-moratorium. None of those 3 projects achieved the allowable FAR in their zone district. And the resulting loss in the number of employees housed is quantifiable. And then the moratorium has come, and not only do you seem to have a tolerance for the ability within the land use code, you've increased the floor area in the land use code for that specific use. So are you encouraging us to allow that property owner to get to their total amount of floor area, or are you encouraging us to throttle the overall affordable housing component to keep the representation or presence of the historic asset that's going to have a bigger building around it?
I think that we're all saying that we respect your ability for that judgment, and that we want you to have it, and that we think that you will apply a balance to it, with your main charge being obviously dealing with the historic asset, because that is your commission. But in the most part, we are giving you a vote of confidence, saying that, yeah, we have liked what we have seen. We have, we do think that you have the right balance and the right take on this. But the problem is that you guys don't feel like you're either empowered, or that you're maybe you disagree with that prioritization of community goals.
Well, I think we feel like our review criteria has been lessened or diminished coming out of the code amendments. You don't.
Sorry, Peter. I think we should get to that next. That's sort of like the fact that
the crux of it.
That the entire project doesn't need to be presented.
Sorry,
Hang on, Ward. Hang on, Ward. Hang on, please. I see your hand up. Hang on 1 second.
I think Peter's point's a good one, but I think that's a separate topic of conversation, is my point.
On which?
The recent land use code changes that now the entire scope of a redevelopment of a project, if it's being proposed as 100% affordable housing, does not need to be approved by
Yeah, we're not
the
seeing
full
them all
HPC
anymore.
board. So right now, it's a combination of staff and one appointed member of HPC in an effort to expedite the process. That's why that change was made. And I think that and I'm speaking for Cara and the team here, and please correct me if I've mistaken this, but I feel like they feel that their oversight and their ability to make those judgment calls that you just referenced has been diminished because they're only seeing what's being done to the historic asset and not what's going around the historic asset. So they can't make those judgment calls that we just all suggested that they should be making because they're only seeing a piece of the pie.
Understood. So the big change in the LUC was that the process change of not going through HPC review.
For the new
For
edition
the,
version.
yeah,
Correct. Okay.
and I would like to respond to your question to me at some point.
Yeah, well, I think we should stay on that topic. I think that was a good topic, so that's why I interjected there. And then I think we should come back to what I just
Yeah,
explained.
absolutely.
Okay.
So I appreciate that you trust us. I'm not looking for clear-cut guidelines. I listen to your meetings and I hear the lack of support for some of our board decisions. And I feel as if there's no pathway for you, like, we listen and we hear what you're saying, but we don't ever get to discuss how we get to an improvement. Like, if you don't like what we're doing, we want to be able to talk to you about it. So that's really, I think, why we've asked to be here today, is to understand what is it that we're doing that is not supported by you. Because I listen to the meetings when you review our projects, and it's not fun sometimes.
Can you give me an example? Are you talking about the previous council where we had a lot of discussion around some of the redevelopment that we saw going on in the West End? Are
Yeah,
you talking
some
about
of
those
the things, yeah,
projects?
the ones that you mentioned where you said you were not happy with some of the single-family residential, like that free market stuff. That's.
But it's not something about HPC's doing. I don't agree with the guidelines in the land use code.
Okay.
And I think you heard that from other council members in the last, that we were not getting out of our historic preservation program maybe what is best serving the community. That was kind of the nature of the commentary then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Roger, you wanted to say a comment, and then I'm gonna go to Ward.
No, I think Bill brought up my comment, but I would like to share something with you all. In the 1980s, I gave tours with the Historical Society, and I didn't wear the period costume. And it was interesting with the other people that gave tours, because when they got to a resource that had an addition, either attached or not attached, many of the people that take those tours, they're architects, they're designers, they're historians, they're very interesting to listen to their comments. And I was the only person that could explain what the city was doing regarding allowing a historic resource to be lifted, a basement put in, so that the resource would be more attuned to what we call modern living. And then the resource was allowed to have an addition to it. Most of the comments were very positive about that type of what we were doing. But the one comment that always came up was the mass and scale of the addition to the resource was overwhelming. And not only does that comment come up from the people in the tours that I used to give, but it comes up with people in the community. And it always has, in all the years I've been involved with it. And it's interesting because we have no recourse. There's nothing we can do about that, because that's the amount of square footage, both to resources that aren't going to be employee housing or the ones that are. We have nothing to say. What we have to say is to those people that take the tour is immensely important, and what we've done was always complimentary. And as a community, I think we've led the country in what we've done in regards to how we've dealt with historic resources in a community. And from my travels, when we've had joint participation with Telluride and Crested Butte, that's brought even more to the forefront. And I hope that that you will allow staff to put budget money into, so that the HBC can have more of those trips, and maybe out of state even. And I would encourage all of you, and I've also encouraged my teammates on HPC to take a tour, particularly when they're busy, when the tourists are here in the summer, and they're giving those tours around the town. Take one yourself and listen to the comments of the people that are taking the tour with the Historical Society. They're actually great fun, and you learn a lot about the house and how it came to be. They're almost as much fun as the ones that they do in the cemetery when they reenact the character that's underground. And History 101 that they give. There's an immense amount of learning that we all can do and we need to do. So I thought it would be helpful, particularly for Bill and for Sam, to hear those comments that I shared with you now. Thanks.
Thank you. Ward?
Yeah, thank you. Tara, what has come before us to protect the historic asset has always been within the guidelines, give or take a couple of variances on setbacks here and there, which I don't think we've ever done a call up, but I don't like variances. But what HPC, I think that the asset has been subordinated to development, speculation, and profit. That too many times I've heard this story about how we're going to spend more time in the community. My brother's going to live here. I'm going to live there, and they get the approvals, and the next day it's listed for sale. So it's turned into maximize the profit. And what that does is it maximizes the input on the community. So it's what the program has become, as I see it, in the years I've been on council, is it really is a tool for real estate speculation. And the projects and the products that have been produced are lovely, but they have a huge impact on the workforce in the community. So when it comes to that balance between what I feel it has become as a tool for development and what I would like to see it be used for is more workforce housing, I have seen developments where left to the discretion of HPC, we lose workforce housing assets, we lose a unit. So I am supportive of maximizing the number of workforce units on a property, and I understand that members of HPC are upset that they've lost the power to have final say and final authority on a land use question, but I don't think the HPC should have ever had final authority on a land use question. So I think it's back where it should be, in that, as I said earlier, I think the land use code takes precedent over the HPC guidelines, and then if the guidelines and the land use code need to be brought into alignment, that it should be done on the HPC guideline side. That the land use code was changed to produce the kind of development that this community needs, which is workforce housing, and not more
Can you make Jeff?
real estate speculation that either becomes a duplex or a single family home.
Thanks, Ward. If you guys give me 1 second, I think Jeff Hafferty's joined us online, so I'm going to give him an opportunity. Jeff, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, sorry about that.
No worries. You had your hand up. Did you want to comment here?
Yeah, I did. I think that, thank you for all, and sorry I was having some technical difficulties, but I was listening to the whole thing. Thank you for all your comments, and Kara for leading us here today for our board. I think, just reiterating, I think what has been said by the council as well as our board, the challenge is the land use versus our guidelines. The mass and scale thing comes up all the time, and no matter how clever the designer or the architect or the developer is, it's still much larger than the 800 square foot historic resource miner's cabin that we typically see. So to have that be a one-to-one balance has always been a challenge. including when we utilize, as Roger said, the subgrade spaces and build out the FAR. The challenge is, I think we need a rewrite when it comes to employee housing, or an extra chapter or two in our employee housing, and as far as approaching employee housing in our HPC guidelines, but I also think in the land use code. Any designer does, like I think what Bill said, is they go to whatever the maximum square footage is, whether it's employee housing development or single family. I agree with Ward talking about the speculative nature of continued the old resources. When I got on the board in '94, nobody wanted to touch a historic property. That's not the case anymore. And it's not just because we've incentivized them, it's because we have the tools to enable a total restoration of the historic resource. That's why we do occasionally allow a variance or an FAR bonus when it's an exemplary project, because in the old days when I started, nobody would really, they'd put the addition on directly on top of the historic resource, but they wouldn't do a true restoration when it comes down to making it look like its original nature. So I think that's the challenging part that we have to deal with. If you look at the miners' cabins that we have restored in the past, I'd say 5 years, you can notice the level of detail and the notice of the historic resource on the type of detailing that has been done. To exemplary detail and fantastic. Yes, what's more glaring is this mass and scale of the additions. And I think that's the challenge that we have as a board, no matter how small the link is or how separate, how far away it is from the resource, how far we push the resource towards the front property line, it always apparently feels much larger. And I think that's our challenge. So I heard your comments too, Tori, and I wasn't taking them personally. We're constantly battling, well, this is what the land use allows us. Here's the square footage. There's only so many ways we can make this cake. So I'm with you. I appreciate the support and everything you guys are giving us as far as our strength in interpreting the guidelines. And quite frankly, we are a quasi-design board, judicial quasi-design board. So you giving us the confidence to try and manipulate the sites with the applicants to make for a greater project is appreciative. And I think we have a lot of smart minds on our boards over the years, not just in the design department, but from a legal standpoint or from a business standpoint. So we try and balance all of those things. And the much more input that you can give us, better strength and backbone and support. I also, like Kara, watch the call-ups and listen to your meetings when they're call-ups, and you have been in conjunction and consistency with our decisions, which feels like we feel like we're doing our job. So I just wanted to comment on that, and I appreciate giving us the time today.
Thanks,
That's all
Jeff.
I had. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Barb, I don't know, you don't have your hand up, so if you don't care to speak right now, you don't have to, but I just wanted to make sure that you have the mic on, and if you had any input or questions that you were able to.
Thanks, Tori, I appreciate that. I think it's, I don't think it's black and white. I don't think it's all either go for the historic resources or employee housing. I feel like there's a very smart staff who's been really good in guiding us, and that I feel like there's a middle ground. I liked what Sam had to say, that that we don't have to sacrifice historic resources for employee housing, nor employee housing for the historic resources. I feel like there's a middle ground that can still honor and respect our culture and our history through the historic resources, as well as provide more employee housing. So I would like, the opportunity for the staff and maybe for other interested community people to gather together to be a little bit more creative and innovative around how can we balance the need. And I think many people in this meeting have said that, and I concur.
Thank you, Barb. Appreciate that. All right, we wanted to come back to the process change in the land use code. I think somebody said you wanted to discuss that. Is it possible to get a simple summary of that process change so that we're all talking about the same thing?
And then maybe also Cara could, I sort of spoke on her behalf, so maybe if there's any color to add.
So the moratorium, there were a lot of things swirling around, a lot of community conversations about a lot of topics. One of the things that we heard pretty clearly was that the community wanted affordable housing, and they wanted affordable housing centrally located. But one thing they were clear about, and because there's been some comments I don't know that are incorrect, but maybe have suggested otherwise, we did not touch any dimensions when the code changes were made during the moratorium. And in these two neighborhoods, where I think most of the conversation, most of the intent around the code change were on Main Street and the mixed use and in RMF, the dimensions stayed the same. Floor area ratios for multifamily stayed the same, heights stayed the same. But I think what we did do is change process. And our intention was to take affordable housing projects that were otherwise compliant with the land use code, did not need a variance of any kind, didn't need a variation to residential design standards. We wanted to make that process streamlined because we had seen affordable housing projects derailed in board reviews, both at P&Z and at HPC. And so for non-historic properties, for projects that are 100% consistent with the land use code, it's an administrative process for the growth management review and for the issuance of affordable housing credits if the project is pursuing that. And so as we thought about these two neighborhoods and had seen, HPC consideration of affordable housing projects related to historic resources, and I'm just going to name the property, 1020 East Cooper, Sue Lum's house, translated into one of the uglier conversations that I've been a participant in this community. And the conversation was about a lot of different things, but it had to do to some degree with the HPC process and some of the design guidelines that I think were brought into the conversation that really, I don't know. So anyway, we could talk more about that if you'd like details, but I think part of the response here was to acknowledge that in these two neighborhoods where there is additional density and has been for a very long time, that the application of those same design guidelines that I think are probably more appropriate for R6 and single family, that HPC in their conversations, in their votes, struggled to navigate, I think, this tension that has been discussed here. So, the intention of this, whether historic or not, was to make affordable housing development more predictable in this community. And, the Sue Lum process stretched out over probably 18 months, and to be quite honest, I was surprised that the developer stuck with the process. Now, unfortunately, because of other issues, that property still sits in its current condition. That's a topic for another day. But, I do think that if you're asking an affordable housing developer who's already operating on incredibly thin margins and making a project pencil to have an unpredictable process associated with that approval that stretches out over 18 months, that's a difficult thing to ask an affordable housing developer to sort of stomach and deal with. And so it was part of the intention of this whole thing. I will also just say that we understood what we were asking of HPC when we changed this. We knew that it was difficult. We knew that it was a change to the way that HPC looked at projects. And, looking back on, the conversations that we had with the moratorium, I think staff feels pretty comfortable that we had a fairly open and transparent conversation with HPC about what this change was, what it meant, how it was different from, their previous authority on these kinds of projects. And so, Amy Simon's on the line. She was involved in writing the code that came out of the conversation with HPC about this process. I certainly was involved. And I can say that between the two of us, there wasn't any intention to strip HPC of their authority. It was to sort of acknowledge this tension in these two neighborhoods where there is additional density and has been for a long time. How does that relate with, affordable housing projects? So happy to answer any further questions about it, and, you know, again, appreciate the discussion this evening, because I know that it has caused some tension.
If we could just summarize, our purview now on this type of project is for relocation and restoration only. And then the rest of the detached, fully conforming structure goes through an administrative review process with staff and the chair of the board or whomever the chair assigns. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I would just add that that administrative review process involves the application of the historic preservation guidelines.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
And if I can, I would just like to say I appreciate the effort that Amy and Ben put into this process. I do think they did a great job of attempting to reach out to us. I attended, I think, almost every session that Ben and City Council had offered to us. So I'm conflicted here. I was a part of many of the discussions. I totally understand where the direction the code went, where that came from. I absolutely would love for HPC to have full review of massing of projects, but I think it's entirely unacceptable for these projects to take 18 months. And I can understand how this was a solution that staff got to. So I think the frustration with the process is more from kind of other members of the board at this point, so I would like them to speak. I am okay with the code as it's written. Because we have one member, and it might not always be me, but we have one member of the board who can review these projects with staff. And these projects need to move faster.
Do you have a sense of the majority position of HPC on this issue?
I'm the minority.
You're the minority.
And we are the minority. I'm going to make an opinion, and then I'd like to get council's response to my opinion. I think that one of the most respectful things that you can do with a historic asset in this community is return it to local living. And in order to return a historic asset to local living, a developer is going to have to fill that property full of people. And to allow them to get to the allowable uses in the zone district is a critical ingredient of having someone make the valuable decision to go towards affordable and away from a free market product that would be their choice to do. So, you know, so do you all feel that bringing historic assets back to local living is a top priority?
That's a separate question, I think.
I'll just say yes. That's exactly what we're losing and missing. How to get it there?
And for someone to do that, they've got to fill the full 5-pound bag if they're going to get that done. That's what has to.
We recognize that. That's exactly why.
So do you recognize that's what needs to happen? And can you direct us in our thoughts and determinations when we have specific projects in front of us for review?
I have been of the opinion that that's what you did with the last code change.
That's what I think too.
That's my interpretation. So
I think that there are those who
the
don't.
board members who don't agree.
Well, I can speak for myself. My support for the land use code changes that happened were to make it more a possibility. We were seeing none.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then we went through an 18-month argument. So, yeah, you know, but again, that comes with your ability, your board's ability to say, hey, this is appropriate. This is complementary to the existing resource. I'll come back to that in a minute. Kim, and then I'll go back online for Ward and Barb.
So I wanted to say thanks to Ben for kind of clarifying the whole process, because I wasn't on the HPC when all of that was going on, so I wasn't part of that. There's just a couple of things that are interesting. I totally agree that we need to have more employee housing, and the best way to do it is to use the assets that we have, whether they're historic resources or other parts of the community. I think there's a great balance that can be struck. But with the new process, I 100% agree things shouldn't take 18 months. I think things get kind of bogged down in small details that projects just keep going back and back and back, and that's not fair to anybody, to the commissioners or to the clients or the customers trying to build these different projects. So I think the streamlining was incredibly important. But I think where some of the people in the HPC are having a little bit of a problem is we don't get to see what the mass and scale is now to see if this new 100% employee housing is going to dwarf the little project. And so moving the little house around on the property, we don't know what's going to be around behind it with the way the new process is working. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion is coming from. It's just not kind of knowing and having any say on what else is going to happen on the property around it. Because then we can't use our discretion to say that's going to dwarf the resource.
And from staff's perspective, in working with council on that topic, once the conversation at the HPC table around an affordable project shifted to talking about mass and scale, it was inevitable that the conversation would include the number of units and discussion, again, going back to the 1020 project, discussion about the occupants of those units and the appropriateness of some of those occupants to be in a given neighborhood. And that dynamic was ultimately what the land use code changes responded to.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Ward, and then Barb.
Yeah, thank you. A direct answer to the question. Yeah, Peter, I think that the best use of a historic asset should be to house locals. That's historically what they would do. They house full-time residents, and those residents contributed to the community. And I fully support the direction that the council took previously to increase the amount of workforce housing units available on a historic asset lot. And I also support working with the local developers with 150 funds to make it work. Anything that we can do that we don't have to build and fund 100% is a benefit to the community.
Barb?
Well, there's nobody in the room, maybe even in the whole community, that is going to say no to employee housing. It's desperately needed. However, when you with the new guidelines, and I think Kim said it probably better than I can, is that when it goes through the HPC on relocation, we have no idea what comes around it. And I think Ben talked to that as well. So you're kind of shooting blind in terms of HPC approval on relocation. We don't know what's above it, behind it, beside it. So it's very frustrating. Again, we keep reiterating, yes, we need employee housing. Yes, we want the historic resources to house locals. Absolutely. Isn't there, but when you've got a 7,000 square foot lot, a 2,500 square foot house, and 9,250 square feet FAR, then it's going to dwarf the historic resource. And I think recently you can go around town and see how Mary Hayes's house is literally a little teeny tiny house on the corner of a lot, surrounded, this is not employee housing, but surrounded by a humongous thing. What can we do? And I pose this for people probably much smarter than I am. What can we do to still honor the historic resource and provide housing locally?
Thanks, Barb. Yep, Bill.
I guess I would ask those who are concerned about the impacts of this process change, is there a different, if you understand the process change and the desire for the process change, but you are also very concerned about the impacts on the historic resource, is there a different level of purview or a different level of compromise that might help us meet in the middle? So instead of only being responsible, to be clear, instead of only being responsible for the relocation and the restoration, is there also some element of the addition that can that the whole HPC should have some purview over, but maybe not every element of the addition? Is there somewhere else that we can move the stopping point on the spectrum to still expedite the process, but also alleviate some of those concerns?
Mr. Mayor.
Philip, did you
But-
want to keep thinking on that?
Doesn't our process allow us to review the footprint of an addition, but,
I think there's a loose description
Some
of
of the-
our purview over site plan.
site planning thinking?
Which, I think at our last application was extremely loosely interpreted. And perhaps that we could see a little bit more information there. And that would just be asking, that's already in the code. That would just be asking for the applicant
And the request to
provide more
move the
information.
historic asset in that example that you're making, the request to move the historic asset, didn't have an ironclad plan for their addition. So what are they doing? They're moving the house. What after that? Whatever fits in the code. So they don't have to show us the rest of what's going on. So maybe somewhere in there needs to be some sense of finality to their plan when they come and ask us for the manipulation of a historic asset.
Ben, would you agree that that could just be in staff's interpretation of what the application requirements are?
As it's spelled out in the code, there's a few steps. There's been some suggestion out in community comments that, the process is uncertain, right? But it's a fairly certain process in that the relocation piece has to happen first, and there's a question of, that's the kind of first piece is the relocation question gets asked. And I think as we were thinking about preservation outcomes, this idea of kind of the first thing being that there was not going to be anything attached to the resource. If there was, it wouldn't qualify for this process. So the kind of typical like 10-foot setback from any kind of additional structures on the property was something that was kind of baked into this.
Yeah.
And then, the relocation criteria about, relationship and to the rest of the neighborhood and how other resources are dealt with in a neighborhood, I think is part of the deal. But I think after that, should an application come in for the rest of the project that wasn't compliant with the code, this process would go back to the beginning with HPC. And so I think from staff's perspective, the kind of mass and scale that's appropriate for the zone district and allowed by the zone district, the height, if we were talking about a single-family addition to one of these properties, we'd be talking about a max height of 25 feet. In both of these zone districts, the max height is 32, so we're talking about 7 additional feet, which I get the dimensions and how that might change the massing and scale significantly. But I think in terms of setbacks, in terms of, I think one of the things is that, any new addition needs to be set back, on the street-facing facade. And then, I think the other things that are in the design guidelines about roof form, about materiality, about fenestration, those kinds of things still apply out of the
And the
design
10-foot
guidelines.
separation from the historic asset in order for it to qualify for the process.
Yeah. And so, I certainly understand the departure for HPC in that you folks are, I think, a design board. I think your interests, most of you, I think, are around the design and the contribution of these resources to, the neighborhood fabric, et cetera, and the support of the neighborhood fabric to the resource. Like, I think that's a lot of what I hear you folks talking about on your board. I think from staff's perspective, the community has already gone through a fairly intensive process, and this isn't recent, this is a long time ago, about these neighborhoods where I think these topics are at question on Main Street and in the RMF, about what the sort of surrounding density should be. And, 32 feet as a max height, and in RMF up to 1.5 to 1 FAR on Main Street, maxed out at 1.25. Those kinds of dimensions and mass and scale of the things surrounding resources have been baked into the code for a long time, and show up in, the projects that are often on neighboring parcels to these homes. And so, I think as we thought about this, it was the kind of dimensions of the neighborhood that were already established for the neighborhood that were kind of giving direction to what HPC would
Bothering
see.
you? I'm muted.
You're not, Jeff.
Thanks, Ben.
Like I said, I'm torn on this. I would go back to what Bill said at the beginning. I think we know exactly what we're gonna get on these projects, once we review relocation. You offset 10 feet, you go to the max height limit, that's what you're going to get. It's very straightforward. So, I think the discretion that, staff and whomever reviews these projects, has to, the amount of stuff that we can apply the design guidelines to is roof form and setback from the front of the house, from the relationship of the new structure to the resource. I think those are really the two things that we get to look at if you're talking about maximizing affordable housing development. So I think we know exactly what we're gonna get, and it's my perspective that if you put the resource in a place that allows the most footprint to develop, you're going to get a better, you give the designer more flexibility to design something that's appropriate. But, so I understand where this code came from. Obviously, we all want to be able to review the massing. We're not always going to agree, but I think one of the benefits to what was written into this is that the resource has to be independent. So that addition could be torn down and redone, and the resource would be safe. So, I don't know. I am okay with how we are, but I could see us having more purview over the site plan, and that site plan being part of our development approval, because that gives us a little bit more information about what happens around the resource, and a little bit more purview. And I think it's my interpretation that is how the code is written, and that already, and that could be part of what we see.
It was certainly not the intention to strip the historic preservation design guidelines away from the new construction on the property. It was simply a change in review process, and I can see the dilemma here for sure.
Are there, anyone else on HPC want to sort of speak to whether more purview on the site plan would help address some of their concerns?
I'm going to ask a question, but I don't want an answer until I finish a little review after the question, okay? We have a historic resource, and it's been restored. And the resource is going to be allowed to have whatever built around it. And the resource has a great deal of integrity. Do you think what's built around it should replicate the resource, or should be distinctly different?
Yeah, that was.
I remember when this concept came up of staff and the chairman reviewing, and that was brought to us when we were dealing with a project on the end of Smuggler. We had a resource, we had an immense vacant lot, and the concept came up, and I voted yes. I said conceptually, I think it's a great idea to expedite to have employee housing, particularly on a site such as the one we were looking at. And then a little bit after that, I was driving into town, and the passenger in my car said, "What happened to Poppies?" And I went, oh boy. And it just woke me up. And I said, we goofed. And I voted for Poppies. And I listened to staff, because most of the time I concur with staff. And I just let it slip. And then along came 1020. Now, from my perspective, my entire focus is on the historic resource. All the stuff that's around it. And all the stories of the people coming in, where the kids are going to move in, and, you know, all that, and they sell it the next day. I don't go for any of that BS. I look at the resource, and I want to maintain the integrity of the resource. And in 1020, something else came up. There were all the other aspects of which we couldn't address. There was parking. There was a dead-end alley. There was movement of snow in and out. There was a number of people living there. All these issues of which we had no purview over. And I'd never thought about those much, but the neighbors did, and the people in the neighborhood. And there was a woman on HBC named Nora Burko, who was born and raised here. And when her parents died, they had to sell the historic house, and the entire project came out pretty nicely. But what was built around the historic house was abysmally large. And Nora Oz brought up what goes on in the alleys in a block. So when I look at a resource, I look at the block the resource is in, and all the impacts that go into that block, much of which we don't have anything to deal with. And so I was pretty determined on 1020 to really not allow anything too large to overtake the resource. Does that mean I was opposed to employee housing? My gosh, no. My daughter lives in employee housing. And she bought a unit, and it's deed restricted, and I think it's marvelous. And the whole concept of employee housing was started in Aspen. I don't know of any other city in the country that has what we have. So I'm a little opposed to the idea that a staff member and one of us can make these decisions. And I think the discussion here now is really might lead to something that'll make a lot of people on HBC a little more comfortable. And we're going to have disagreements, which is fine. And I totally concur with what Ward says. I have no disagreement with Ward. I think his strong stance on that is fine. We may not agree on it completely, but so now I'll go back to my question. And when you look at what happened to Poppies, and you look at the resource, and you're taking somebody on a tour, they can't pick out the resource from the little cube next to it. So I'd like to hear from you all that one question, because it also goes back to what we're dealing with on other projects that will come up on Main Street. And we're going to have something built around the resource, and we're stuck. I mean, all we can do is say you can move the thing, but what's going to happen around it? It's really a blind issue, and it's very disconcerting for us that are so concerned about historic resources themselves. So I think the question, do you want it different or same, is really an integral part of that.
I'm going to go to Ward. I'm going to answer, and then I'm going to go to Ward. For me, it's there's one size doesn't fit all. I have seen the examples of where it's not made to look different and have a separate feel to it, and sometimes those work and sometimes they don't. I've also seen them where they are built and they are, I'll use the word complementary, and they do look like the resource, and it works and it strengthens the resource. And I've also seen it where it doesn't. So for me, it's not one size fits all. I can't really tell you. I think that in some situations, it's better that it matches up. Other times, I don't think it should, because you want to set that apart. But it's on a case by case for me. I just can't say one size fits all. Sorry. Ward, did you hear his original question and then your comments?
Yeah. Bill brought up the question about, is there something that could be done that would make HPC feel a little bit more empowered about the additional, other than just moving the historic asset? And I've been thinking about this, and I think that there's certain, I'm not a developer, but developers have told me that they do not like uncertainty. So if we have a certainty about the unit count, like you're going to get 7 units out of this, but the HPC has some review and design consultation and some room to negotiate or to work with roof lines or fenestration, a number of things to make the new property or the new addition to the site, differentiating that from addition to the historic asset. But when we talk about addition, I'm talking about additional buildings to the site. Specifically, I don't like faux Victorian or faux anything really. If you want to make the asset stand out, and draw attention to the asset, then the surrounding buildings should be different. And I know it, you know, it's been brought up 1020, Roger brought up poppies. Those are, you know, those are some properties that had some lasting impact. And Ben went through the whole, highlighted some of the things that went on with 1020, and it was, yeah, I don't think it was a beautiful process. I think that in that process, we did lose one workforce housing unit. So that's a family of workers that could not live in the neighborhood because that was part of the review or negotiation process. So I can see that if we have certainty that on 100% affordable, you get a certain number of units, then you can work with HPC to make a little bit of changes in the design so that it does allow the historic asset to stand out. And I've mentioned this a number of times. I know HPC doesn't have any purview over colors, but if you look at poppies, everything is just white. And if you look at poppies, the building, the historic asset, before it was redeveloped, the buildings had a beautiful paint job, and they made them stand out. So I think it's probably going to be the same thing that's going to happen with the property that we recently looked at. I would like to see it remain stand out the same color. We saw a property on Main Street where TDRs were severed, and I wanted them to allow the historic asset to stand out because the paint job just made it disappear. So I think that there could be some flexibility with the HPC to have more of a review of what the new property is, because you look at the guidelines and HPC can only approve where the building moves, and then it's administrative from there. If there are some powers to work with the developer on some design, yet given the certainty of the number of units and the floor area ratio, or the number of square feet that are available for development, I think I could support that. And again, just to reiterate, I think that it shouldn't blend into the surrounding new buildings. I think the new building should be allow the historic asset to shine.
Thanks, Ward. Sam, if you'll just answer the comment, what's your feeling about building the same, building different?
Once again, I think it's situational, and my whole idea behind this meeting is giving some peer review back to the HPC to make that decision on a case-by-case basis. I think you guys know best. That's where I'd like to see this going.
Bill?
Thanks. In my experience, the best results have come with a contrasting structure. So I think the community kind of learned its lesson in the 90s, where in the West End we tried to make a whole bunch of faux Victorians, and those weren't always additions to a historic asset, but they just don't look the same. They don't look authentic. So I like contrasting.
John?
I agree. I think diverse architecture is really what sets Aspen apart. And as Tori mentioned, some of the faux neo-Victorian architecture, it doesn't work as well as other approaches.
Thanks. Kim?
The one comment I wanted just to add to what Ward was saying is, I appreciate that you guys all trust us to do our jobs and use our discretion. But I think the main point of the process change was so we could avoid 18-month reviews and all of that. So if there's some way we could come up with a plan that maybe we get to do a little more of the design review, but it's still in that same one meeting. Because I feel the pain for people that they really want to have certainty and be able to know I can go to this one meeting and then I can move on. I have a yes or no, or you can do this with this condition. But to have to keep going back, I think that's where the process gets bogged down. And I think if we could have just a little more say in that one meeting, having a little more information brought to us at the beginning, but still leave it at just, I mean, maybe it can't always be one meeting, obviously, but.
Can I ask that all the board members answer Bill's question of Woodmore site plan review purview get you there?
I think more site plan review and maybe just the massing. I'm not as uncomfortable as some of the other board members on the new process because I'm new on the board. But I can see why that can be sometimes hard to say, I'm okay with moving the house 2 feet forward or 10 feet forward because I don't know what's going to go behind it. I think that's where people are getting kind of hung up.
Sounds good. I made a list here. I mean, from roof lines to setbacks and separation, site plans, unit counts. There's a couple of different levers that we can pull, and we'll figure that out. That's why these guys are here listening intently, because they're going to hear what we're talking about today, and they know how this process works best and what we can maybe utilize. They'll come back to you, I'm sure, to check in with HPC as we move forward with any improvements that we're going to do. Okay, I want to go to Peter. Earlier you brought up 1 or 2 things that you said you might wanted to have discussion on, so we're going to hit those right now.
It's related to what we were talking about, in as much as the guidelines state in one spot that a new addition should be complementary to the asset, and then in another part of the guidelines it says that it should be a product of its own time. You know, I'm happy to hear that a majority of council's interested in seeing a historic asset be its own self and have a contrasting additions around it. You know, some examples have been made. I'm gonna humbly make another example that hasn't been made, and that is the example at 518 West Main. And I did build that, but you know, you don't need to have a historical preservation tour to walk by in front of that and see that that's the Elgin cabin and that there's an addition there. And so we've got the example of poppies that we've all decided we don't like. I'd like to make the example of what would be different and a departure of the Poppies project, and I believe that 518 Main serves to show us what the result is of a contrasting addition to the historic asset. I'm more in favor of going that direction, and I hope that you all are too. That's what I wanted to.
I think that's where we are.
I think that's where we are.
That's where we are.
So it was what I wanted to talk about, and then we got into the discussion.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I think that's where we are, and I think that's what you're hearing for support from council members on behalf of the community. Again, it's that there's examples of that contrast that aren't contrast, right? So, there could be modern architecture that is painted all white along with the resource as well, and it doesn't work. And yet the architect and the owner would say, no, we did the contrast. Look, those are totally different. A building of its time, sure it is, but guess what? It's neither complementary nor set apart. So, but I think we're clear on that point. Just to answer your question. Okay, that was where you wanted to be. I want to now open it up. If you have any further clarification questions, something that we didn't touch on that you'd like to hear more on, and then I'll do a little bit of a summary of where we're going.
You can bring it up.
One thing that, when you hike up Smuggler and you look down at Aspen, we're an urban forest. And when Tage Pedersen's brother came here in the late 40s and became a landscaper, a lot of the trees he planted are pretty large now. So one thing that happens with trees, if they're inappropriate for the lot, because the Victorians have pretty antiquated plumbing, the roots can completely destroy it.
Yeah.
So therefore, it should be easier when we're dealing with a historic resource to allow some of the trees to be removed rather than have to save every tree, because you can plant a more appropriate tree that's going to grow up and it'll be more applicable to showing off the historic resource and not being detrimental to what's underground going into the resource. So I've asked for quite some time that we have a meeting with Parks, and I think it would be wonderful if you all can encourage that sort of thing to happen so that both parks can be happy about preserving trees, which we're not against trees, but sometimes we need the leeway without a lot of argument to be able to deal with vegetation that might be detrimental to the resource, both aesthetically and practically.
I would add that it also can add to the mass and scale problem that we deal with when we have to keep a tree that parks requires us to keep, which just
Right.
makes the addition that much, larger around that tree, when really that tree is not going to be there forever, and we're making development decisions based off of that. So I would echo.
Okay, I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
it's a good point. I agree 100%.
So to that end, I would make a request of staff if you could maybe info-only memo what our tree removal policy and what process that goes through, so that we can understand more of the detail about what they're talking about.
Also, may I make one other comment
Yes.
on in that vein? I was at a resource the other day talking with the owner, and there was a tree that owner had called parked several times, and the tree's dead, and it's tilting, and it could actually take out the resource at any moment, and they haven't responded. And I think, particularly with historic resources, that I would ask parks to make a little extra step with the trees around those resources so that the tree doesn't take out a resource.
Thank you for that. Bill?
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with our tree regulations as they stand, and I think that there's a great point here.
I think there's a great point here, and I fully support HPC having some ability to have some flexibility on trees. So I think it's a great point, and I'm glad he brought it up.
We'll get some more information on that topic. Any other items that you wanted to touch on? Anything that we did not? Any additional?
No, I mean, I think the site plan, I'll come back to the site plan question that you asked, Bill, because I think that's already written in the code. I think any of the other things that we would discuss to change HPC's purview would be code change, significant code changes, and that we just went through that process. So that would just kind of complicate quite a few things, which is why I was interested to hear if there was any support for our further purview over site plan review, but that would be it.
Okay. With that, then, I just wanted to go over, we had a discussion around, obviously, the number one was purview, maybe additional information during review. You were saying that site plan or footprint is part of process, but maybe there's opportunities for roof line setback separation. Unit count is even something that came up. We want more information around tree removal policy. I was wondering about review purviews as it relates to P&Z, HPC, and staff. One example was given over on 1020 Cooper that was talking about snow removal, things talking about parking, and I'm just wondering where in review these items, who is in charge of those as part of review? And I don't need specifics right now, but if that's easy to answer.
Yeah, Ben, get in here whenever. Broadly, the way that the new process is written for, again, this is specifically about properties with a historic resource where 100% affordable housing is proposed in conjunction with that resource. HPC's purview is limited to the relocation of the resource and the preservation of the resource. And so if it's parking or snow storage or wildlife enclosures or any of those things are being reviewed by a combination of an HPC staff member and the historic preservation staff, HPC board member and the historic preservation staff working in the community development department. And they apply the land use code and the historic preservation guidelines to the remainder of the development proposal.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, that's a broad brush, but if that covers it, that covers it.
The only thing that I would add is that, I think that whether it's the land use code or other sections of the municipal code, we rely on those code sections to guide development. And so related to engineering standards in the alley or trash removal or snow removal or snow storage, any of those kinds of things that, any kind of development, whether it's a single family home or a multifamily or commercial property, like we've got a lot of rules in our municipal code and in the land use code to try to regulate that stuff. And, I think again, just to kind of reinforce, if any project under this process came forward that didn't comply with any of that stuff, whether it's trash removal or trash storage or wildlife enclosures or whatever, it would be a project that wouldn't comply with this kind of expedited review process. And so I think for all of these projects, we rely heavily on the regulations that are established in the municipal code, including the land use code.
Thank you. I heard discussion around language change in 11.2 that talks more towards complementary descriptors when it comes to additions, and the cleanup of the conflict that is in our land use code describing exactly that it should be complementary, yet it should be completely different. Let's just make sure that language does work with each other, and if it doesn't, we need to clean it up. And then we talked about the process change. At this time, I don't think we're looking at process change as much as perhaps a small tweak at the front end of review that can incorporate other items to give HPC a little better understanding of what they are supporting or not supporting.
I'm not sure I have clarity.
Turn your mic around so she doesn't say that.
Thanks. I'm not sure I have clarity on whether that HPC will be happy with that or not. So I would love to know how we're going to get to consensus on that process enhancement, if you want to call it that. You know, I don't know if we want to do this during this meeting or as a follow-up, but, you know, will HPC be satisfied for now with a site plan review as part of these 100% affordable housing projects or not? I mean, Cara said she's in the minority, so she can't speak for everyone on this. I don't know. I'd like to know the answer to that. Whether that happens in this meeting or later, I don't know. And if so, what action does that take on our behalf, if any? I don't. It sounds like maybe that's already in the code and just needs to be administered a little more heavily. So I would really like to get the majority of HPC to a place of comfort on this. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that does it or not.
Staff shares Councilmember Guth's desire for clarity on council's desire to, frankly, amend the land use code to respond to some of the input from HPC tonight. And that direction is going to be critically important for us as we think about how to respond.
Well, then the first question is the site plan part of the review criteria?
With the application for the relocation, there was a very simple site plan that gave minimal information about the footprint of buildings. And I will say, additionally, we have not seen an application yet for the new construction. So whether those footprints that were submitted related to the relocation effort, other than those buildings being separated from the resource and there being sufficient space to kind of move around the property for, you know, practical needs, you know, I can't evaluate whether or not, you know,
yeah,
on one application or the next, the site plan that comes forward on relocation and how it might relate to a sort of future more developed application.
I would really caution you about.
Absolutely. We're done with that.
And please, go ahead.
So my suggestion is that this is what these guys need to think about and talk to them about. We're not ready to suggest any land use code changes because we don't know what the realm of possibility is.
I appreciate you saying that, and that was going to be similar to my comment, which is, at this point, staff believes that given the fact we haven't gotten through a single complete application with the changes that the previous council put in place, we would struggle to find the right opportunity in the land use code to respond to these dynamics, because again, we haven't seen them play out. And so up to now, we don't believe we have enough information to respond to, again, to respond with some kind of code amendment.
Philip, if the majority of the HPC said, yeah, if we could review site plan, that would address some of our concerns for now. Does that give you and Ben pause, meaning do you think that will interrupt or do you think that that will cause the process to take significantly longer than it does under the new process?
So there's sort of several things there. One, yes, in staff's view, having worked very intensely on this for 8 months last year, it was very clear to us that as soon as there are public hearings related to mass, scale, particularly unit count, and the intensity of the use on the site, that the public response to those meetings would result in the loss of some of the affordable housing units on a site-by-site basis that council had directed us to ensure were delivered for the community. And so, to put it as succinctly as possible, yes, the greater the purview, whether it be P&Z or HPC, over a site-specific development proposal, the greater the opportunity for there to be the reduction in overall number of affordable housing units. And that's how staff got to the proposal that we presented to council, and council agreed with that position and approved it unanimously. So that is absolutely, I think, the dynamic that's at play here. But I think in addition, I've been listening closely tonight. I actually haven't heard a specific outcome that the HPC is concerned about other than about the process itself and the sort of scope of their purview. Because again, we haven't seen a project play out with the new process. And so we would struggle because all the work that staff has to do to support council in amending the land use code has to be justified in sort of concrete, on the ground development outcomes that council can point to and say, this is not in support of community policy. And I just haven't heard that tonight. And so we would struggle to respond with language that would, in my professional opinion, absolutely deliver on an outcome that council is ultimately looking for. I just haven't heard that tonight.
Yeah, I understand.
Kim, comment?
I can't remember.
Okay.
I will say that I'm satisfied with the process as it was amended by staff and council during the moratorium. You know, it's certainly whenever there's a change to the process, there's going to be some struggle with it, and it needs to settle in. It needs to either prove itself as effective or ineffective before you start changing it. But to the extent that what can you do for us to help us make decisions and streamline applications, you can tell us what you support. You know, we heard you say tonight that housing is a goal, and that at the expense of historic assets, full recognition. You know, it sounds to us like that's a give and take that you're willing to give to turn those places back to local living again. And this is what I wanted to hear from you guys is hey, listen, you need to hold those historic assets as sacred, or two, we as a council understand your job as historic preservation commissions, but we need to have you be cognizant of the fact that competing goals exist and that we need to be sensitive to them. That's what I think I'm hearing you say.
Thanks.
I'm not here because I'm unhappy. You're the boss. I mean, you make decisions. I think we came because we were a little bewildered and confused about the new regulations. And we just wanted to know ultimately what our stand will be. And you make the decision, and then we follow along, and that's fine. I think what's happened is hopefully we've made you aware of a lot of concerns, and hopefully we will make you more aware of HPC, and hopefully you'll learn from that, and you'll take the time to even be better at what you do. I did want to make one final comment. The other day I was over at Ann Mullen's house, and we were standing outside, and behind her across the street is a process where a panaboat has been fully restored. And the addition behind the panaboat is a wall. It goes up. And I looked at Ann and I said, she said, Raj, I approve that. I said, that's a big wall. And she says, yes, it is. And I said, it is interesting how the process sometimes forgets about the impact on the rest of the neighborhood. And that's one that we all have to look at. And are we unhappy with what we did with that proposal? No, but it's very impactful. So can we do things in the future that will alleviate that? And again, I looked at her and I said, it all comes back to allowable square footage. And it comes back to mess and scale. And that's not what we make those decisions. That's up to council. So part of why we're here is to make you aware of what we've seen. And that's something that we saw. And I think it's something that both staff and you all need to take consideration of. One final comment. I was here when Amy was hired. And Amy has done a great job. And Amy she's changed as we go along, and ideas and so on. And I think staff does a pretty good job of trying to deal with the concept of here's the resource and here's what's behind it. Does it have to match or not match? And I think they really are fighting with that themselves. But I think they're doing, over all of our projects, I think they've done an excellent job. And I think our new member here will follow suit with those that have gone in the past. So I've had a lot of fun, and I've learned a lot, and I've made mistakes. And I don't want us to I think we need to learn from our mistakes and get better. But we got a great town. We got a great history. We've got some wonderful projects, and I think we should all be pretty happy with what we're doing. I think we should be able to pat ourselves on the back, and at the same time, we should be able to say, I really blew it on that one. And thank you for having us here. This means a lot.
Thank you very much. Did you remember?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you too for just taking the time to meet with us, to hear our concerns and to giving us some direction. And I think to Bill's question, when he asked what would make the HPC happy, maybe what we need to do is come back with a very reasonable request of, we know we want to keep this process very streamlined to move projects forward. Because I know I won't speak for anybody else, 100% in support of employee housing and the streamlined process. But just so there's a little level of comfort, we'll come back to you with, this is the small little adjustment maybe that we could put in there, just so everybody feels more comfortable in making their decisions.
We'll wait to hear from that. John?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Ben Anderson for his very thorough and in-depth explanation as to how we got here. I really want to point that out. And then I also want to thank Roger for his remarks and pointing out the Alm House, I think it's called, on Hyman. That's very close to where I live too, and it's a particularly egregious example of mass and scale dwarfing the historic resource. And I do want to emphasize what you said too. In spite of everything, we have a very good-looking town. I think everybody can agree on that.
Bill?
So I want to sort of explain where my fears come from, which may be shared by some members of HPC or may not. I fear that we might be taking away some of the power of architecture. And what I mean by that is the HPC, made up of such talented and passionate people, can sometimes, and I've been through this on the applicant side many times, can sometimes help guide the outcome and can help coerce a better outcome for the community. And sometimes that's at the expense of the applicant. Sometimes it's something that the applicant just hasn't thought of. It can come as a result of a variety, or it can come at a variety of costs, some of which are not financially that great. But my fear is that what we're setting up for is the potential for a mistake where we just have a large box that's built as inexpensively as possible, with very little architectural character, very little incentive to do so, and very and less review criteria than we've had in the past. And when I'm talking about a box, I'm talking about specifically the non-historic addition to in a 100% affordable housing scenario. And I think that a full review by HPC can help to mitigate that risk. And so that's what I am concerned about here. I'm not concerned as much about whether the community is going to lose affordable housing units as a percentage of this, although I respect, Philip's experience, particularly on 1020 and other projects, and I hear that. And I know it's an inefficient process, and maybe on large projects that have a large impact to the community, that's okay. And maybe an extra year to deliver affordable housing units to the community is okay. To me, that's more okay than having a brutalist structure next to a beautiful historic asset. And maybe we could improve that brutalist structure. I'm using brutalist as an example to represent what I mean here. A characterless, inexpensively built, not thoughtfully designed structure. Maybe a little bit of coercion by the HPC to make that addition more beautiful could really help the eventual outcome. So that's where I'm coming from here ultimately. And again, I don't know if members of HPC share this or not, but I'm not trying to necessarily make the additions smaller, but I want them to be good quality, thoughtful, appropriate, respectful to the historic assets, and attractive for our community.
I think that sums up what the HBC is afraid of completely.
That is exactly
We
right.
don't want giant boxes behind the resources.
Of those HPC members that are not ready to use the new process, most of them are not ready to use that new process out of fear of what's coming beside it. So to whatever extent we could reduce that fear from the segment of the board that has that feeling is going to allow a comfort level for the rest of them to vote yes on a project that they might be voting against out of an unknown.
Well, Kim volunteered your board to come back to us with some ideas.
Yep.
I volunteered our staff to also be thinking about this. You know that the five of us are going to be continually thinking about this. We're looking for improvements. We are not leaving this meeting saying, all right, our work is done. We're glad to see you guys as well. We think that we have some refinements that we can make. Maybe they're not in this calendar year as it relates to some items, but definitely this conversation and the solutions that are going to come from it start right now and start right here. So,
Thanks.
Bill, I thank you for summarizing kind of that last piece, because that's where we're all sitting, is that we want to make sure that HPC has a level of comfort with the work they're doing on behalf of our community. And council wants to have a level of comfort that we are not overburdening you or putting you in the wrong position to be able to achieve that. So thank you guys so much. My last comment today is, again, a big thank you to you guys. Making the sausage is nasty business sometimes. As Roger said, we're not all going to agree on stuff all the time. But if we're moving in the same direction, we have the same intentions for our community, that's what's going to make us get to the best result. I've spent a couple years at this table in different capacities, and I never get everything I want. But I work with others to make sure that the community gets what's the best for the community, and I think that's what we're all going to be doing. So we have our work cut out for us. Thank you guys so much for taking an additional night of your time to meet with us on a Tuesday. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We look
Thanks,
forward
Council.
to keeping this communication line open.
That's good. Ward.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I just want to thank HPC members for being here. And I regret that I'm not there in person, but when my daughter was born 40 years ago today, this meeting wasn't scheduled. So I'm in Truckee celebrating a family birthday, and thank you so much for this opportunity to discuss these issues with HPC.
Thanks, Ward. All right, that's our agenda for this evening. Thank you as always to GrassRoots. We'll be back next week.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.